Hello, let's discuss SSL decryption. Okay, so why do we need an SSL first of all, or why do we need an TLS? So we have a client, we have a web server. Client is want to access the web server, which is a public web server, like something with a google.com or bank server or e-commerce or some web series, Netflix, whatever, right? Which is hosted on the internet. So if the client want to access this web server, it is not going to the private network. It is going to via the internet, right? And internet is not secure, so we could not communicate over the plain internet. So to have a protection over there, what we have an SSL connection, right, or the TLS connection, right? So SSL, or once the TCP three-way handshake completed, then we have a SSL or the TLS tunnels established between the client and the server. Okay, so that is how why we need a client and the between the SSL or TLS connection between the client and the server for the safe or the secure way to have a payload or the traffic from point A to point B. But what we have a call the concept called the decryption. So decryption, if it's a decryption, we are just breaking the stuff, right? So decrypting it instead of the encrypting, we are decrypting. So one thing is already secure, but we are decrypting. Why? And why we are decrypting, which is already secure? Because we could not trust the client also, right? So what the client wants to, some organization or some big enterprise, they have some policies, right? They could not uh, take a risk of the attacks, right? They could not take a risk of anything which goes bad while communicating. So they will decrypt it, what exactly the client is sending over the internet via SSL or TLS tunnel. So they will decrypt it. They will do a deep packet inspection. So in the deep packet inspection, it's not like they will just have a look on the header. They will have a look on the payload, right? Once they will get to the access of the payload, they can, then you can easily identify the what kind of an application is it any kind of a threat or not, or is it any data exfiltration, right? They will check for the data exfiltration. Data exfiltration is generally when we have the bank card number or sensitive data, right? So that is why we are doing this sorry, SSL decryption. So so firewall or any other device which sit in the client and the web server. So instead of the one SSL connection, it will have a two SSL connection. So the client would always assume that okay, the my firewall is only the web server, and firewall try to fake it himself as a server, like a bank server or a Google server, or a e-commerce server. And the client will have always think that okay, the firewall itself is a my server, because so instead of the two SSL connection, we have an SSL connection one, SSL connection two. Okay, so firewall, what is a firewall over here? It's acting as an SSL decryption. Okay, and the other important concept over here is the certificates. So if it's a web server, so web server is a public facing server. It should be, so there's a server certificate. So this server certificate is always signed by the root CA, the global root CA, like a DigiCert. Uh, let's there's one more, let's SSL, or there are total 8 or 9 root CA, which which is available in the market. Okay, and the firewall, what the firewall have the firewall has its own internal root CA. Okay, so the firewall own this root CA, and this root CA used to generate the internal certificate for SSL decryption. Okay, so it so once the firewall generate the internal certificate, then it will sign by its own root CA. It's a self-signed root CA, and the firewall also has a set of the public root certificate to trust the web server's traffic, like a DigiCert and others. The client have a root certificate, internal root certificate, so that if the if the firewall sending some internal certificate which is signed by itself, so that it can trust it and establish an SSL connection. If that root certificate is not present over here in the client, then it will never have an SSL connection to be established. Okay, so all of the client should be have the internal root certificate, right, which is owned by the firewall. So that is the whole the story goes on. So we need so once you're reading about the web, this kind of concept, so root CA plays a the certificate plays a very important role, and need to understand what is a root CA, what is a root certificate, right, what is the internal certificate, what is a server certificate, what is a device certificate. So these are the important concept of the certificate. Okay, thank you.